The low hum of the aircraft's engines created a dull background buzz that somehow made the luxury of first class feel almost too quiet. Ethan and Elijah Holland, dressed in matching navy polo shirts and khaki trousers, walked confidently into the cabin of Flight 612, bound for Chicago. The plush leather seats gleamed under the soft, warm lighting, and the air was tinged with the smell of fresh linen and expensive perfume. The passengers were settled in, some adjusting noise-canceling headphones, others carefully placing their briefcases in the overhead bins. The atmosphere was serene, so serene that the arrival of two young men in their early 20s in casual attire felt almost out of place. But Ethan and Elijah weren't just any passengers. They weren't people who were used to feeling out of place in first class, but today was different. They had grown up with everything they needed: wealth, influence, and access to the top. But on this flight it was clear that their presence was about to be questioned in a way that had never happened before. They approached seats 2A and 2B, taking careful steps towards their assigned places, but the moment they neared their seats, the flight attendant, Cheryl Gates, appeared seemingly out of nowhere. She smiled at them, a tight, forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice tinged with an edge of condescension. Ethan was the first to speak. He offered his boarding pass, trying to diffuse the situation with calmness. "We're in 2A and 2B, he said politely, but Cheryl didn't immediately take the boarding pass. Instead, she glanced at it and then looked up and down the aisle as though she was searching for something, or someone. "Are you sure these are your seats?" she asked, her voice cool and dismissive. She didn't even glance at the boarding pass, but kept scanning the cabin. Ethan stood still, holding the ticket, waiting for her to take it. Elijah shifted his weight from one foot to the other, but said nothing. He could already feel the uncomfortable weight of the moment pressing down on him. The flight attendants around them noticed the tension. A woman in pearls briefly looked up from her tablet. A man in a gray suit sitting a few rows back raised his eyebrow. But no one said a word. The discomfort settled in the air, thick and suffocating. "Your parents aren't with you?" Cheryl finally asked, her tone changing to something that could only be described as suspicious. "No, ma'am. We travel alone often," Elijah replied, his voice steady but growing quieter under the weight of her judgment. Cheryl smiled again, but this time it was laced with something sharper. "Well, that's brave." She chuckled, a low, condescending sound that didn't sit right with either of them. Ethan had heard this kind of tone before, but Elijah was visibly uncomfortable now. Ethan turned his gaze toward his twin brother, giving him a slight nod. "Let's just sit down, Elijah," he said softly, trying to keep things calm. Cheryl moved in their way, though not quite blocking them completely. She pulled out a small radio from her belt, clicked a button, and whispered into it. The cabin fell into a still, unnatural quiet, and the passengers around them began to shift uncomfortably. The air was thick with tension. A flight attendant who had been standing by the galley shifted on her feet. No one said anything. Cheryl turned back to the twins, her smile now firmly in place. "Why don't you boys wait here for a moment while I check a few things?" she said, her tone not as sweet as it had been before. It was now laced with something else, something more controlling. Elijah stepped forward, offering their boarding passes. "We have our tickets," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Cheryl didn't take them. Instead, she waved them off. "It's just a precaution. Sometimes the system glitches. We wouldn't want you sitting in someone else's seat by mistake." Ethan's patience was starting to wear thin. "These are our seats," he said firmly, holding up his ticket. "We are assigned to 2A and 2B. Cheryl looked at the boarding passes for a moment longer, then back at the boys, and finally back at the boarding passes again. She narrowed her eyes, as if scrutinizing them more carefully this time. Then, without any further words, she looked away. But the silence in the cabin had already turned heavy. "You sure these aren't printouts? Anyone could make something like this," she snapped. The accusation hung in the air like smoke, seeping into the tension of the cabin. Ethan's face remained neutral, but his eyes narrowed just slightly. He could feel the weight of her words, like they were accusations, even though they hadn't done anything wrong. "That's an accusation," Elijah said, his voice suddenly sharper, standing a little taller. He wasn't about to let her speak to them like that. "It's a concern," Cheryl replied loudly, as though trying to make sure everyone in the cabin heard her. As she spoke, phones began to appear subtly. Some passengers had started recording the scene. A quiet murmur spread throughout the cabin as the tension built. The unspoken rule of the modern world. If it's not on camera, it didn't happen. Ethan glanced at Elijah, and then, as if by instinct, he sat down in his seat, 2A. Elijah followed suit, and they both fastened their seat belts slowly. There was no need to make a scene. They hadn't done anything wrong. They just wanted to sit in their assigned seats. Cheryl's voice rang out again. "I'm going to need you to stay here while we sort this out. We'll get everything checked." But the twins weren't backing down. Elijah reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, unlocking it and hovering his finger over the live stream button. They weren't going to let this go unnoticed. The minutes that followed felt like hours. A quiet voice on the PA system informed the cabin that the plane was waiting for clearance. But that wasn't the issue. The issue was the silent tension in the air. All eyes were on Ethan and Elijah, as though they were somehow the problem. Passengers exchanged glances. Some whispered quietly to each other, but no one said anything out loud. No one spoke up on their behalf. A few minutes later, Ron Walters appeared. He was dressed in a suit and looked every bit the part of an airport gate supervisor. But there was something about his presence that made the situation even more uncomfortable. His eyes were already scanning the twins, sizing them up as if they were the problem, not the system that had failed them. "What seems to be the problem here?" Ron asked, his voice flat as though this was just another routine matter to be handled. Cheryl didn't waste any time. "They're in 2A and 2B with questionable boarding passes," she said without hesitation. "We just need to get it cleared." Ron didn't look at the boarding passes. Instead, he took one look at Ethan and Elijah and then turned his attention to the flight attendants. He had already made up his mind. Ethan stood up slowly, a calm defiance in his posture. "We're not moving," he said, his voice soft but clear. "We're in our assigned seats, and we're not causing any problems. Boys, come with me. We'll sort this out outside the cabin," Ron said, gesturing toward the jet bridge. He had already made up his mind, but Ethan and Elijah weren't backing down. Not this time. "We're not going anywhere," Ethan repeated, his voice growing more resolute. Ron raised an eyebrow. He was used to people complying, but these two weren't backing down. They weren't giving in to the pressure, and it unsettled him. He looked around the cabin, almost expecting someone to step forward to help them, but no one did. The silence was suffocating. Ethan made eye contact with Elijah, giving him a slight nod. Elijah reached into his pocket, his fingers finding the familiar phone. Without a second thought, he pressed the live stream button. The world was about to see what was happening. The entire cabin could feel it now, the power of being watched. The tension in the cabin was unbearable. Elijah's thumb hovered over the camera button, ready to make the scene go live to the thousands of viewers who had begun to watch this quiet confrontation unfold. Ethan's calm defiance contrasted with the growing noise in his chest, the adrenaline building with each passing second. The passengers, still silent, were clearly uncomfortable, yet not one of them was willing to speak up. It was as if they were all waiting for someone else to break the silence, someone else to stand up for what was right. As Elijah hit the Go Live button, a wave of comments flooded in. Some were confused, some were furious, but all of them were watching. The cabin had gone from being a place of quiet luxury to a stage, and everyone was now an audience. "They're saying we don't belong in first class," Elijah said, his voice steady but laced with an edge of frustration. "Even though our boarding passes are verified and we've done everything right." His eyes scanned the cabin, catching glances from the passengers who had begun to whisper amongst themselves. "Yeah," Ethan added, his gaze calm, but his words dripping with the quiet anger they both shared. "They're assuming that because of what we look like, we don't deserve to be here." He looked out the window for a moment, his fingers tapping gently on the armrest. "This is what it feels like when you're treated like you're invisible, like you're not even supposed to exist in a space where you've paid to be." The weight of the words hung heavy in the cabin. The world outside the plane was far away, but inside, it felt like everything was closing in. The comments on Elijah's screen kept flowing in faster and faster, as the tension inside the plane continued to mount, and then, without warning, the Wi-Fi cut off. The screen on Elijah's phone flickered, the signal symbol turning gray as if the world outside the cabin had disappeared. The connection that had been their lifeline, the one thing keeping them visible to the growing number of viewers, was severed in an instant. Silence filled the cabin again, but this time it was no longer the quiet hum of first class. This silence was deliberate, oppressive. It was as if someone was trying to erase their story. Elijah looked at his phone, now useless in his hand. The live stream had been cut, but the fight hadn't stopped. The injustice still hung in the air. The fact that they were being treated like criminals for simply sitting in their seats they had legally paid for, felt like an absurdity. But this absurdity was their reality now. Ethan leaned forward, his voice lowering so only Elijah could hear. "Don't let them win," he said. "We don't need the stream to make them see what's happening. We just need to stay calm." A small, almost imperceptible nod from Elijah, and he reached into his bag. He didn't say anything as he pulled out a small portable hotspot and slid it under the table. The device hummed to life almost instantly. The Wi-Fi signal icon on his phone lit up again, and within seconds the screen came back to life. The comments started flooding in immediately. "Where did you guys go? What's happening? We lost you for a second. What did they do? They can't do this to you." Elijah smiled grimly as he looked at the influx of support. His fingers hovered over the screen before he went live once more. The camera flickered to life, and Ethan appeared beside him, still calm but with a visible sense of resolve settling in his eyes. They were going to be heard, whether the airline liked it or not. "We're back," Elijah said softly, but the strength in his voice carried far beyond the limits of the cabin. The view count began to climb again, steadily. 400 viewers, 800, 1,000, soon it was reaching the thousands. We're still in our seats. Our boarding passes are legit. But they're trying to move us. Why? Because we don't look like we belong here. Ethan's voice was firm now, controlled. He wasn't angry, not anymore. But the calmness was strategic. He had learned from experience. His father's lessons about how to respond in moments like this. Facts were the key to winning. Fury had no place in it. "We're not asking for sympathy," Elijah continued, the words steady, measured. "We're showing you what it looks like when people assume we don't belong somewhere, just because of how we look." The comment section exploded in real time. People were starting to understand. The weight of the situation was sinking in. The twins weren't asking for pity. They were asking for respect, for recognition, for the world to see the kind of systemic discrimination that had been brushed aside for so long. The tension in the cabin was palpable. As the seconds ticked by, Cheryl and Ron, the gate supervisor, seemed to have no idea what to do with the boys. Cheryl stood stiffly near the galley, arms crossed, her eyes shooting occasional glances at Ethan and Elijah. The rest of the passengers remained silent, their eyes fixed on the unfolding drama, but no one was willing to speak up. It was like a social contract had been established. No one wanted to be the one to make waves. But then something unexpected happened. A flight attendant, someone who had mostly gone unnoticed up until now, walked down the aisle. She was in her mid-30s with her hair pulled tightly into a bun, and she moved quietly through the cabin, collecting empty glasses and plates from the passengers. She didn't stop to make eye contact, didn't seem to have any particular interest in the conflict. She was just doing her job, or at least that's what everyone assumed. But as she approached the boys, she leaned down slightly, speaking in a hushed voice. "I don't agree with how this is being handled," she whispered. Elijah's eyes snapped up to meet hers. For a moment, there was a flash of disbelief in his eyes. "What?" he whispered, unsure if he had heard her right. The woman glanced over her shoulder, checking that Cheryl and Ron weren't paying attention. "I can't say anything publicly, but I can help." She pulled something from her pocket, her personal phone, and slipped it under Elijah's tray table. "Here's a hotspot," she said quietly. "Password is Dignity First. Use it. Share it quickly." Elijah blinked, stunned by the gesture. He wasn't sure who this woman was or why she was helping them, but he wasn't about to question her intentions. He nodded slowly, his hand shaking slightly as he took the phone. "You sure?" he asked quietly. "I am," the woman said, her voice low and steady. "Go live. Show the world. They need to see this." Before either of them could say anything else, the woman moved back down the aisle, continuing her work as though nothing had happened. Elijah stared at the phone in his hand, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. This was their chance. The scene had just taken a turn. Elijah quickly plugged the hotspot into his phone, and within seconds, the connection was back. The live stream was re-established. The comments flooded in again. Ethan and Elijah looked at each other. Both of them knew this was the moment to seize. The moment when they could stand up not just for themselves, but for anyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. "We're back," Elijah said again, his voice full of resolve. "They tried to cut us off, but we're still here. We're not backing down." The viewers' comments began to fill the screen. Questions, exclamations, and words of encouragement. "You're showing us what it really looks like," one comment read. "This is history in the making." The power had shifted. Now, the story wasn't just about two young men being wronged. It was about the world watching, the world understanding, and the world demanding change. The more the viewers saw, the more they understood that this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of something much larger, something that needed to be addressed. As the stream continued, the tension in the cabin didn't fade. It only grew more pronounced. Every few seconds, a new comment appeared, flooding the screen with support, questions, and outrage. Yet, inside the cabin, the atmosphere remained thick with unspoken judgment, the eyes of the passengers fixed firmly on Ethan and Elijah. No one said anything. No one offered help. The scene had turned into a silent battle, and the twins were fighting for more than just their seats. They were fighting for their right to exist in that space without being questioned or ridiculed. The gate supervisor, Ron Walters, had yet to take any meaningful action. He stood at the front of the cabin, silently watching the unfolding situation, his arms crossed over his chest. But then another figure entered, the kind of figure whose presence would shift the balance once again. A tall man in a neon yellow vest stepped into the first-class cabin. His badge read, L. Chambers, Airport Operations. He looked calm, composed, and he wasn't going to be swayed by the usual airline procedures. His eyes locked on the boys, and he immediately scanned the cabin, assessing the situation with an almost practiced air. Cheryl, the flight attendant who had started this entire confrontation, quickly straightened at his arrival, eager to explain the situation to someone who might back her up. But Chambers wasn't interested in her explanation. He turned his attention directly to Ethan and Elijah. "Boys, let's talk outside," Chambers said, his tone businesslike but not hostile. Ethan remained seated, not moving an inch. "We've done nothing wrong," he said quietly, his voice unwavering. "We're in our assigned seats, and we're not going anywhere." His calm demeanor spoke volumes, something that the passengers had begun to notice. These young men weren't intimidated. They weren't backing down. Chambers looked at him for a long moment, then glanced back at the flight attendants who had been trying to handle the situation. "You two," he said with a small shake of his head, "are good to stay here. The system just had a delay." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "A delay? You mean a mistake?" Chambers paused for a moment, then nodded slightly. "Looks like it," he said. His voice was laced with a slight edge of frustration, as though he knew something had gone terribly wrong here. "Everything's in order now. Your seats are confirmed." As he spoke, the tension in the cabin seemed to ease, if only slightly. Passengers who had been watching closely now exchanged looks, some even murmuring softly to one another. Ethan and Elijah stayed seated, the weight of the moment still pressing down on them. A strange sense of quiet victory settled in the cabin. No one applauded. No one said anything, but for the first time in the entire ordeal, the air felt just a little bit lighter. Ethan and Elijah hadn't been moved, and that was a small victory in itself. Just as the boys allowed themselves a brief moment to breathe, their phone buzzed. It was their father, Anthony Holland. Ethan immediately answered the call, his tone still calm but now tinged with a deep sense of resolve. "We're good, Dad," Ethan said as he pressed the phone to his ear. "They've confirmed our seats, but things got a little tense up here." On the other end, Dr. Holland's voice was firm, yet controlled. "I've been hearing reports," he said. "We're not going to let this go. Let me know if you need anything and keep documenting." Ethan nodded, a slight smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. "We've been documenting, Dad. We're good, but there's more going on here than just a seating mix-up." Before Dr. Holland could respond, Elijah turned to Ethan, his face lit up by the screen of his phone. The live stream had reached thousands. The comments flooded in faster than they could read, and people were starting to pick up on something bigger than a simple seating issue. This wasn't just about first class. This was about how black passengers were treated differently, and how those differences were often dismissed or ignored. Just then, the live stream cut out again. The Wi-Fi symbol on Elijah's phone blinked into nothingness, and for a second the comments froze. It felt as though time itself had stopped. "Not again," Elijah muttered under his breath, his eyes flicking to the ceiling as if to will the signal back to life. Ethan's face remained composed. "We can handle this. Keep going," he whispered. The silence that followed was palpable, but Elijah's fingers hovered over the phone, ready to turn it back on. And then, something miraculous happened. A flight attendant, who had been quiet and unnoticed until now, walked up to them. She wasn't one of the main staff. They hadn't seen her interacting with anyone else, but she had been quietly moving about the cabin, serving drinks and clearing trays. She leaned over and spoke in a hushed tone that only Ethan and Elijah could hear. "I don't agree with how this is being handled," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can help." Elijah froze, a slight gasp escaping his lips. "You can help?" he asked, surprised by the sudden offer. The attendant nodded. "I can't say anything publicly, but I'm with you on this. I'll get you connected." She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a small device, handing it to Elijah. "Use this. It's a hotspot. Password is Dignity First. Share it fast." Elijah was stunned. "You're serious?" he whispered. The woman's eyes met his for a brief moment. Then she turned and walked away, her expression unreadable. With shaking hands, Elijah plugged the hotspot into his phone. Within seconds, the Wi-Fi symbol lit up again. The screen came back to life, and the comments flooded back in like a tidal wave. "We're back," Elijah said quietly, his voice firm with resolve. "They can cut us off, but they can't erase the truth." His eyes scanned the screen, taking in the comments, feeling the weight of the support behind them. The number of viewers was growing again, reaching the thousands. More and more comments came in, some expressing anger, others support, but all of them speaking one truth. People were watching. They were witnessing everything unfold. They were seeing the truth behind the headlines. Ethan sat up straighter in his seat. "This isn't just about us," he said to the camera, addressing the viewers. "This is about something bigger. This is about everyone who's been made to feel like they don't belong, just because of the way they look." The moments that followed were a blur. The flight crew was visibly on edge, now unsure how to handle the situation. But it didn't matter. Elijah and Ethan had taken control. They weren't asking for permission anymore. They were demanding that their dignity be respected. Their father's voice echoed in their minds. Always fight with facts. And that's what they were doing. The cabin was thick with tension. With every passing minute, more passengers quietly shifted in their seats, exchanging glances, but no one spoke. No one was willing to intervene. All eyes were on the twins, but this time they weren't just passive observers. They were the ones who had seized the power, turning this situation into a public spectacle that couldn't be ignored. As Elijah's phone flickered with the increasing number of comments, the numbers climbed. 5,000, 7,000. 10,000 viewers. The world was watching. The pressure inside the plane felt like it could break the walls of the cabin. But Ethan and Elijah had already decided they weren't backing down. The lives of millions of people who had been forced into the same quiet corner of discrimination were now counting on them. Then, something happened that they weren't expecting. The voice of Officer Moore cracked through the quiet hum of the plane's atmosphere. He was tall, stocky, and his uniform looked crisp. Everything about him screamed authority. He moved toward them, his eyes locked onto Ethan and Elijah, but he didn't acknowledge them directly. Instead, he spoke in an almost emotionless tone. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice cold and unyielding, "it's time to come with me." Ethan's gaze didn't waver. He had no intention of moving. "On what grounds?" he asked, the words coming out slow, deliberate. Moore didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a step closer, as if trying to intimidate them with his size, but Ethan remained perfectly still. "There's been a dispute about your seating," Moore finally said, his words clipped and sharp. "The flight crew has requested your removal." Ethan exhaled deeply and sat up straighter, leaning in. "I'm asking again. On what grounds? We're sitting in the seats we paid for. What law are we violating?" Elijah, sitting quietly next to his brother, spoke up. "We've done everything right. We've followed all the rules. If this is about the crew not verifying our tickets, then let them do it properly." The officer's jaw clenched slightly, but his face remained impassive. "I'm asking you to move to coach," he said, still holding the zip ties loosely in his hands. It was clear this wasn't just a request. It was a demand wrapped in veiled threats. Ethan and Elijah exchanged a glance. They didn't flinch. They didn't even budge. Their faces were calm, but their eyes held a quiet storm beneath the surface. They were standing up for something far bigger than themselves now. "I'll ask you one more time," Ethan said, his voice measured and controlled. "Are you refusing to verify our boarding passes? Are you refusing to follow protocol?" Moore hesitated for just a fraction of a second. But it was enough. Ethan had drawn a line in the sand, and Moore's indecision was clear. But before the officer could respond, another figure entered the scene, someone who had been watching from the sidelines, but now his presence was undeniable. A second officer stepped into the aisle. She was younger than Moore, dressed in a crisp uniform, but she wasn't here to enforce the rules. She was here to make sure the situation didn't escalate further. She had a tablet in her hands, and the body camera strapped to her vest was clearly visible. Her stance was authoritative, but calm, like someone who was used to managing situations like this without resorting to unnecessary force. "Officer Moore, stand down," the woman said, her voice clear, professional, and filled with authority. For a brief moment, the tension in the cabin shifted. Moore's eyes flicked toward the new officer, and there was a flash of recognition. He didn't respond immediately, but his body language shifted, just slightly. The power dynamic in the room had changed, and even Moore knew it. He stepped back, his eyes narrowing in irritation. But he didn't argue. The woman addressed Ethan and Elijah. "I've been briefed on the situation," she said, her voice steady. "There's been a misunderstanding, but it's been resolved. The system shows you're good to stay in these seats." Ethan didn't speak right away, but Elijah's eyes widened in disbelief. "You're telling us that now?" he asked, incredulous. "Why didn't anyone check this earlier?" The officer's expression softened, but she didn't offer any excuses. "It's been a hectic day," she said. "But the important thing is that you're where you're supposed to be." Ethan nodded slowly, but he wasn't ready to let it go. "The real question is why it took this long for anyone to check. Why was our dignity the first thing questioned? Why are we always made to prove ourselves in situations like this?" The silence that followed was heavy. The officer didn't respond, but it was clear she understood the weight of the question. Ethan's phone buzzed again, this time with a call. It was from their father, Anthony Holland. Without hesitation, he answered the call, holding it up for the entire cabin to hear. "We're fine, Dad," Ethan said calmly, though his voice betrayed the slightest hint of frustration. "The seats are confirmed, but we've had to deal with a lot more than just a seating issue." The voice on the other end of the line was composed but unmistakably firm. "I'm hearing reports from multiple sources," Dr. Holland said, his tone clipped. "Do I need to get involved further?" Ethan glanced at Elijah, who nodded. He held up his phone for the cabin to hear. "This is my father," Ethan said to the passengers who were now paying full attention. "He's the CEO of Holland Aerospace, and he's aware of the situation." The realization hit the passengers. A quiet murmur passed through the cabin as some people whispered to each other. unsure of what they had just heard. A few passengers straightened up, their attention now fully on Ethan and Elijah. But it wasn't over. The woman officer, still standing beside them, gave them a small nod of approval, acknowledging their composure. "You're not going to be removed," she said, her voice calm but stern. "And there will be an investigation into what's happened here today. We'll make sure that things like this don't happen again." With the situation in the cabin finally de-escalating, Ethan and Elijah felt a mixture of relief and disbelief. They weren't going to be removed. The truth had been acknowledged, but the fact that they had to fight so hard for something so simple, their right to exist in this space, still stung. But it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the minutes stretched on, the rest of the passengers began to relax, some nodding to each other as if they too had been part of something bigger. But for Ethan and Elijah, the battle was far from won. They had fought for their dignity, but now the larger questions loomed. Dr. Holland's call had sparked something. The weight of his words wasn't lost on anyone. The legal ramifications were already beginning to surface, and the ripple effects were sure to follow. The truth was now out there, and no amount of airline spin or corporate gloss could cover it up. What had happened on Flight 612 wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a system that was broken, a system that needed to be fixed. Just then, the phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't just a notification. It was a call from someone unexpected. A voice crackled on the other end, familiar yet formal. "This is George Milton, the head of the board of directors at Skyline Airlines," the voice said. "I'd like to speak with you about today's incident." Ethan glanced at Elijah, who raised an eyebrow. This was the moment. The call from George Milton, the head of the board at Skyline Airlines, lingered in the air like a ticking clock. The tension that had been thick in the cabin now felt palpable, like something larger was about to unfold. Ethan and Elijah exchanged glances, their faces unreadable. This wasn't just another corporate apology or an attempt to deflect blame. This was the moment when the entire situation, everything that had been building up, was about to take a new direction. "Mr. Milton," Ethan said, his voice firm but respectful. "What is this about? What do you want?" There was a slight pause on the other end before George's voice crackled back through the phone. "I've been briefed on the incident. It seems this situation is a little more complicated than we initially thought." "Complicated?" Elijah muttered under his breath. His frustration was beginning to show. "What does that even mean?" George's voice didn't waver. "I think it means we need to talk about how this was handled. You two were clearly treated unfairly, and there are bigger questions about what went wrong here. I'd like to offer a formal apology on behalf of Skyline Airlines." "It's the least we can do." Ethan narrowed his eyes, his grip on the armrest tightening. "A formal apology?" he repeated. "I don't think an apology is going to fix what happened today. This wasn't about a mistake. This was about assumptions and biases that were made before we even walked onto this plane." There was a silence on the other end of the line. Ethan could almost hear George's breath as if he had to take a moment to digest the weight of what Ethan had just said. "You're right," George finally admitted. "I can't deny that. This wasn't just a glitch. But what I can offer, what I will offer, is an assurance that we're going to look into this and make changes. I want to personally guarantee that we will be reviewing our internal protocols, specifically how we handle situations like this. I want to make sure this never happens again." Ethan's pulse quickened, but his voice remained steady. "It's not just about making sure it doesn't happen again. It's about the system that allowed it to happen in the first place. The fact that you can even say that this is a glitch shows how deep the problem runs. This isn't just one rogue flight attendant. This is something that's ingrained in your company's culture. Your entire process needs to change." Elijah leaned back in his seat, his gaze distant as he listened to the conversation unfold. It was clear that this wasn't just going to be some corporate cover-up. It was the beginning of a larger conversation, one that needed to be had, whether Skyline Airlines was ready for it or not. "We're listening," George said, his tone changing. "We'll get in touch with you soon to discuss how we can make this right. But in the meantime, please understand that we are not trying to minimize what happened here. We're committed to change. "I'll believe it when I see it," Elijah said, his voice sharp, but it wasn't anger, it was exhaustion. They'd fought hard enough for respect. Actions speak louder than words. We need to see real change, not just a few cosmetic fixes. The conversation ended with a promise to follow up, but Ethan and Elijah knew that the real work was just beginning. The fight wasn't just about their seats anymore. It was about creating an environment where people of color didn't have to fight to be seen as equals, where they didn't have to prove their worth every time they entered a space. As the call ended, the air in the cabin shifted. The passengers, who had been quiet up until this point, began to murmur among themselves. Some exchanged glances of approval, while others whispered in disbelief. Ethan and Elijah sat silently for a moment, taking in the weight of the situation. The plane began its descent toward Chicago, but the turbulence in the cabin had yet to settle. Ethan and Elijah had been at the center of something much bigger than themselves. What had started as a simple matter of seating had morphed into an all-out examination of how systems of discrimination could manifest in even the most mundane places, like an airplane. And now, as the plane approached its destination, the hard reality of what they had just done began to sink in. They hadn't just fought for their right to sit in first class. They had done something much bigger. They had brought attention to a much larger issue. They had stood firm in the face of something many people in their situation would have simply accepted. But they didn't. They fought back, not with anger, but with facts, with dignity, and with unwavering resolve. Ethan felt his phone buzz again. Another call. This time it was their father, Anthony. As Ethan answered, Elijah turned his attention out the window, looking at the city below as it grew larger with each passing second. They were about to land, but the fight wasn't over. "Not by a long shot. How are you holding up, boys?" Dr. Holland asked, his voice calm and steady, the way it always was. But there was something in his tone that told Ethan and Elijah that he wasn't just checking in. He was proud. "We're good, Dad," Ethan said, glancing at Elijah, who nodded. "But we've only just started. This isn't over." "You've already done more than most people would in your position," their father said, a note of admiration in his voice. "I'm proud of both of you. But I need you to remember that the fight ahead won't be easy. It's not just about one airline. This is a systemic issue, and the only way to fix it is to keep pushing." "We know," Elijah said, his voice quiet but determined. "We're not stopping here. We'll keep pushing. This is bigger than just us." The conversation with their father was brief but impactful. As Ethan hung up the phone, the weight of what they had done was no longer just about proving a point. It was about ensuring that their actions would have long-lasting consequences. The plane began its final approach to the runway, the familiar rumble of the wheels touching down. But for Ethan and Elijah, the feeling was different this time. They weren't just passengers. They were agents of change. They had just started a conversation that was far bigger than the one they had walked into that plane with. And as they disembarked from the aircraft, the silent respect from the airport staff, who had watched the events unfold, spoke volumes. No one needed to say anything. They knew what had happened. They knew who had made it happen. The ripple effect from the incident on Flight 612 was just beginning to take shape. By the time Ethan and Elijah had disembarked, the media had already caught wind of the story. Clips of the live stream were spreading like wildfire across social media, and news outlets were picking up the story. But this wasn't just another viral moment. This was the beginning of something much bigger. As the days passed, the story gained more traction. The public outcry over the treatment of Ethan and Elijah was overwhelming. People were outraged, not just by the airline's actions, but by the broader issue of racial bias in everyday situations. The fact that two young men who had every right to be in first class were treated like they didn't belong had struck a chord with so many. But as the story continued to spread, it wasn't just public support that was growing. So was the pressure on Skyline Airlines. Behind the scenes, the company was scrambling. The CEO, Patricia Williams, was under fire. Her team was racing to control the narrative. But it wasn't enough. The story had already taken on a life of its own. The pressure was mounting, and it was clear that changes had to be made, not just within Skyline, but within the entire airline industry. The storm that had been brewing for days reached its climax just as the boys were settling back into the routine of their lives. They had taken the fight to the airlines, to the system, and to the world. And now, it seemed, things were starting to shift. The air was still thick with anticipation, but the pressure had found its release. In the days following the confrontation, the ripple effects of their actions continued to grow. The incident on Flight 612 had become a flashpoint in the ongoing battle for racial equality. Headlines were plastered across news outlets. Social media exploded with support, and the hashtag 9 and Dignity First trended globally. Ethan and Elijah's names were now synonymous with standing up to systemic injustice. They had become symbols of quiet, determined resistance, and the world was watching. But even with all the media attention, the brothers knew this wasn't about the fame. This wasn't about becoming household names. This was about something far more important, ensuring that the airline industry, and by extension, society, was forced to confront its biases, its systemic inequalities, and its unspoken assumptions. As the dust began to settle, a formal statement came from Skyline Airlines, delivered under the watchful eye of the media. The CEO, Patricia Williams, stood at a podium with her board of directors behind her. She appeared on a live broadcast, a calculated move to regain control of the narrative. The cameras were rolling. The world was watching. "I want to offer my sincerest apologies to Ethan and Elijah Holland," Patricia began, her voice steady but strained. "What happened to them on Flight 612 should never have happened. We are committed to ensuring that all of our passengers are treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. We recognize that today's incident exposed deep flaws in our protocols, and we are taking immediate action." There was a collective murmur of disbelief as she continued. "Effective immediately, we will be implementing mandatory unconscious bias training for all of our staff. Additionally, we are launching an independent audit of our seating assignment systems to ensure that no passenger is ever unfairly treated again. This is just the beginning of the work we have ahead of us." It was a carefully worded statement, one that would likely placate the media. But for Ethan and Elijah, it didn't change the fact that this was just one small step in a much larger process. They had fought for more than an apology. They had fought for a system that recognized the humanity in everyone. They had fought for a future where their children wouldn't have to face the same injustices. Despite the apology, the story didn't end there. Behind the scenes, the ripple effect was still in full force. Dr. Anthony Holland, their father, had taken a leading role in discussions with federal officials. The Department of Transportation was now involved, overseeing the review of airline practices across the country. Ethan and Elijah's actions had sparked a legislative shift. The very systems that had allowed their treatment on the plane were now under review. The government was not just listening to their story, they were moving forward with real, tangible action. Dr. Holland had become an unlikely voice in the fight for racial equality in the aviation industry, using his influence to push for broader reform. The ripple effect was now being felt in every corner of the industry. "We will not be quiet until we see meaningful, lasting change," Dr. Holland had said during a press conference, his voice calm but unwavering. "This is not a fight just for my sons, but for every passenger who has ever felt that they were treated as less than simply because of who they are." The time for change is now. As the weeks passed, other airlines began to follow suit. Delta, American Airlines, JetBlue, all of them issued statements in solidarity with the Hollands. They, too, would be reviewing their internal systems, implementing new policies to prevent discrimination, and holding their employees accountable. And it wasn't just about airlines. Public conversations about systemic racism had reached new heights. People were listening, really listening, and for the first time the question of how race impacted everyday life was being examined with brutal honesty. Companies, schools, and institutions everywhere were reevaluating their own biases, looking closely at their own systems and wondering, could this happen here? What are we doing to address these issues? At the center of it all stood Ethan and Elijah. They hadn't just been witnesses to a broken system, they had become active participants in its repair. They were no longer just passengers in first class. They were architects of change. As the weeks went on, Ethan and Elijah found themselves invited to various panels, conferences, and speaking engagements. They had become more than just the faces of the viral moment. They had become leaders in a movement for change, change that was long overdue. One evening, as the twins sat on the rooftop of their family's home, watching the sun set over the horizon, they took a moment to reflect. The phone had buzzed with another news alert. Another major company had made a public commitment to diversity and inclusion. It was a win, but it was just one in a long series of steps. "It feels like we've just started," Elijah said, his voice quiet but full of determination. Ethan nodded, his gaze far away. "Yeah, it's bigger than us. But we've got to keep pushing, keep speaking up, keep making sure the world sees us. The change isn't going to happen if we just sit back." The weight of their responsibility hung heavy in the air, but it wasn't the burden of an individual task. It was the shared mission of a generation that was fighting for something bigger, a fairer, more just world. As the night grew darker, the glow of their phones flickered again. Messages from supporters, messages from activists, and from those who still didn't understand. "We've made a difference," Ethan said, his voice tinged with quiet pride. "But it's only just begun." And as the lights of the city below twinkled, they knew that they had set something in motion that could never be undone. The battle was far from over, but the fight for dignity had already changed the course of history. The weeks that followed were a blur of meetings, press conferences, and interviews. What had started as a quiet act of defiance on a single flight had spiraled into a global movement. But amidst the whirlwind of attention, Ethan and Elijah found themselves asking a simple question: what next? Their role in the movement had been solidified. They were no longer just the boys who had sat in first class. They had become the public faces of change. But for them, it wasn't enough to be just symbols. They needed to ensure that the changes they had fought for were real, lasting. As they worked with lawmakers, activists, and companies, they saw the impact of their actions slowly begin to take root. The airline industry was making strides, but that was just the beginning. The broader question was how to reshape a society that had been built on assumptions, on stereotypes, and on biases. Could one moment of visibility truly lead to lasting change? Ethan and Elijah knew that the path to a more just world wasn't going to be easy, but it was a path they were ready to walk, every step of the way. The final resolution wasn't just about getting an apology from Skyline Airlines. It wasn't just about the policies they helped put in place. The true victory lay in the shift in perspective. People were listening. People were waking up to the harsh realities of discrimination and bias. And for Ethan and Elijah, that was the greatest triumph of all.